that you're able to at least see what I'm saying, particularly since the microphone is sort of, actually we've got two microphones there, and sometimes they may pick up, a little bit better than others. So anyway, let's go back to economic actors, okay? So you've got three groups. And by the way, this is also discussed in your text. And there's also discussion about this in multiple places on the internet. And we talk about the next evolution of this to build a model. I'll talk about what that is about here, something called the circular flow model. Households, natural persons, they can be as small as one person. By the way, there was an effort a few decades ago, really, to try to redefine this term household. Because households, are changing in terms of their composition, in terms of their dynamics. It's not always the case that you've got, the sort of traditional TV example of a family necessarily of a married couple and 2.3 children or whatever that belong to them. Instead, a lot of households differ. In fact, I would say probably that's not even the most common form of this. Today, you've got adults who may or may not be married and may have children from other marriages or relationships, and you've got also multiple generations, and you've got cousins and aunts. I know certainly in my household, we've got my sister-in-law and her daughter live with us. I've got my wife's aunt who lives with us. So in addition to our my own wife and son, so it's difficult when you say households, because what are we really talking about here? So a lot of people thought, well, let's just deal with individuals as opposed to households, because households are not really a thing that you can nail down because of the changing demographics households are. But that didn't really last very long, and the idea of households kind of came back to life, mostly because of the fact that households tend to make a lot of decisions, particularly in terms of housing, as sort of a joint and collective effort. And so we still use the term household, while recognizing the fact that the individual composition of households themselves has changed over time. And today, same-sex marriage is perfectly legal, and where once it was not, and it was in fact banned in a lot of places around the country. And today that is perfectly legal. And so the individual composition of what households are has changed, but nonetheless, economically, which is really our concern here, is how economic actors behave, and they tend to behave in ways that are fairly common, regardless of what the individual internal compositions are. That is, they work, they earn money, they spend, and they make decisions based upon their earning power, and make decisions as to borrowing and saving and all of those kinds of things, regardless of what the internal compositions are. So that's one group, and all of us belong to some sort of household, I presume. I can't imagine anybody who does not belong to a household of some sort. I guess maybe people in prison, maybe that'd be a difficult thing to consider a household, but maybe we should exclude that portion of the population. But so that's households. And the second one is business firms. And we're talking about firms here. I know sometimes people think the term firms refers to law firms or accounting firms, professional type, but we're saying any kind of a company that meets these two characteristics: privately owned and operates for profit. Privately owned and operates for profit. Those are considered business firms. And I want to point out here that it looks like we've got a missing piece of the puzzle here. And I want to make sure that I address it so that everyone is clear that I'm aware that it looks like, or a bit like, we're missing something. And that is the not-for-profit part of the economy. Because there are a lot of organizations that would not meet this requirement of being either privately owned or for-profit. And there are lots of not-for-profit activities out there that both employ people, that spend money, that invest, that borrow, that save. CNN being one of them. We're not a for-profit operation at all. We're sort of quasi-governmental in the sense that we're funded and regulated, heavily controlled by the state of New Mexico. But what about things like not-for-profit hospitals, or any kind of religious organization or charitable organization, well, which there are many? And are we trying to exclude them for any particular reason? And the answer is no, because here's the upshot of this. Here's the reason, and that is the not-for-profit part of the economy acts economically very, very similar to how business firms act. And when I talked about the fact that a lot of these not-for-profit operations employ people, buy goods, save, invest, borrow, all these kinds of things. They're acting from an economic standpoint, much like firms. And so I just want to point out that it's not an omission. It's not a deliberate omission. It's not a slight. It's just that it doesn't, the economic behavior isn't that much different. So if you want, you can sort of include them there if you like. Okay. But for the most part, we're not going to be talking that much about the not-for-profit part of the economy. We will talk a little bit about business firms. And for those of you who are interested in not-for-profit economics, there are those opportunities down the road if you want to study that. The final one is governments. And here we talk about governments. We'll talk about this from the US standpoint. And one of the things that makes economics a little bit easier to talk about in an introductory course is to focus on a particular economy. And so we'll focus on ours. And yes, I did note that we're going to get into a bit of the international economics, because I think it's important for everybody to have a feel for what's going on around the world economically. And that's one reason why this week's discussion exercise sort of asks you to step outside of the United States and look at some other country, at least one other country, and say, okay, what's going on in South Korea, right? And what does that system look like? Because their governmental system is probably a bit different. But I will focus, for purposes of our model, which is what we're doing here, on the US. We have a federal and state division in our country. That is, we've got a central government based in Washington, obviously, and then state governments. Local government in the United States is a function and a subset of state government. So Bernalillo County in Albuquerque, for instance, as one example, really is a part of state government, even though it sort of operates oftentimes seemingly independent. It's not really, okay? It's not really independent at all. It's it's a subset of what state government is about. So we talk about governments, we're talking about the federal government based in Washington and state divisions. And so when we talk about these three actor groups, we can put these together then in terms of what we call sectors. And, okay, so sectors. And that is, we can take two of those together, households and firms, and say they belong to the private sector. They belong to the private sector. Now, what is the private sector? Well, the private sector is essentially this. It's the non-governmental part of the economy. And here you could also include not-for-profits if you like, where decisions are made privately and then these actors own self-interest. They do what they want. So if you're a household and you want to go buy a motorcycle, you don't have to run it by anybody. You just have to go do it. It's on your own. You want to quit your job, quit your job. You don't have to run it by any governmental agency or whatnot. I'm not saying that every economic decision is independent of a government, because you can't just say I'm going to become a dentist. License to do that. But your decision to become a dentist is your own, and it's your own particular decision. Nobody tells you from the age of 5 you're going to be a dentist, or the age of 12 or whatever. You can choose. And by the way, people can choose to change occupations all the time. I was in banking for 18 years and didn't think I would be going into academia, but it turns out I sort of migrated there. And so I've done a career change in my life. And so it's very likely that you will too. And so from a household standpoint, you're free to make these kinds of decisions, and you're free to do it for your own particular reasons. It's your choice if you want to do something. People, if you want to buy a motorcycle, you buy it because you want to buy a motorcycle, right? And it's not, you don't have to worry about what other people think. It's your own choice, okay? The public sector, on the other hand, is different because it's government. It's comprised of that third actor group, government and all its agencies. And here, decisions are made publicly, and they're made in the public interest. They're made in the public interest. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about this idea of, okay, government needs to do something like build a road, right? Well, it's going to impact people if a road is going to be built. They're maybe going to have to buy land from private landowners. Those landowners may or may not wish to sell. They may be compelled to sell because government does have this sort of aspect of sort of forcing people to do things. This is one of the things that makes government a bit controversial. Government can do things oftentimes with of its own accord, and they'll do it seemingly in the public interest, but sometimes people in the private sector may object to what they're doing. And we certainly see this happening all the time. For instance, a city wants to, well, let's say a sports franchise in a major city needs a new stadium, and really sort of says, okay, I'm going to move my team to wherever if you don't build me a new stadium with luxury suites and all this stuff and lots of parking, and I get a big share of the hot dogs and beer that's sold and whatnot. And so a lot of times local governments have been ponying up for that. We've seen this time and time and time again. By the way, I lived in Charlotte for a few years, North Carolina, and they had an NBA franchise, the Charlotte Hornets. I know we have one now. That's not the original Charlotte Hornets, though. That owner said to the city of Charlotte, I need a new stadium and you're going to build it for me. You're going to pay 100% for it. And the city of Charlotte said, no, we're not. And he said, I'm going to move my team to New Orleans. And they said, fine. And he moves. And they eventually got a new team back. And I think they called themselves the Bobcats for a while, which I don't know where that came from. But now that I know that you might not know that is not the original team in the NBA. So sometimes cities push back against this idea of cities being forced to pay for stadiums is very controversial. Is it truly in the public interest? Well, that's a controversial question. I bet I could pull out people at random in this class and say, yeah, it's a good thing. You know, what's wrong with having us, have civic pride, right? That we have a team to root for. It brings us together. Okay, that's an argument. Others would say, what a gigantic waste of money to spend all this sports stadium to enrich private owners and these millionaire athletes who probably don't deserve it anyway, right? So that's an argument. So again, I'm not saying one way or the other. I've got my own opinion on this, and maybe I'm trying to be a little bit too cute here by trying to mask my opinion, but nonetheless, I do think that I do think that's a controversial subject. So whenever you involve government, you've got that kind of thing going on. Okay, so those are the sectors of the economy. Other questions for me about any of that as to what we're doing? I'm going to do some model building here, and I'm going to turn off the okay, I think I'm back. All right, sorry about. I apologize, guys. I turned off the. Did everybody hear me? Okay. Okay, good. I turned off the projector, and when I did that, I turned myself off. Okay. Okay, so I think we're back in business here. So I turned myself off when I did that, and I apologize. I don't think there's. I'm going to have to figure out what to do about this issue.
There must be a wrap to get off.
So,
No, but I thought it was like the other one.
I can't believe I forgot about this. I can't believe we both did illegal terms.
guys, you
I
want to
can do
mute
that
yourselves,
for
please?
once, too. Let's say that.
Everybody mute yourselves. I'm getting a lot of sort of feedback here if you don't mind.
Oh yeah. So where was I with the story?
What?
Where was I with the story?
Guys, can you mute yourselves, please? Thank you. Okay.
So.
A lot of feedback. So I'm going to
Oh
figure
yeah.
out.
So I was driving back home.
Guys, I need you to mute your.
I thought it was at 2 still, and I got there. Or no, I was going in Dichotomous through that little neighborhood. I think I ran over a nail.
Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So I'm going to have to, every room is different. So one of the things that we're noticing is that because the rooms are different, all the technology is a little different. So we're going to have to figure out how to turn the projector off and keep the camera on. And I know there's a way to do it because
do my Zoom meeting.
I'm not
That I
familiar
thought
with
was at 2 still.
So guys, please mute yourselves. So we're talking about the circular flow model. Okay?
If you let me
So
finish
let's
the
take
story.
these actors here,
Anyways,
and I'm going to sort of put these into a model.
I was freaking out,
Okay.
and then after
And
that, I
by
was
the
in the
way, the
house,
circular flow model is
and
discussed in
I
your book.
let Dad know, and I was like, he's like, I'll talk to you in a second, so he's working. And then after I checked on the
flow model is discussed in your book. And
then I got on the
by the way, if
but then I found out
you were to
that
do term circular flow model, you
in the
have
last minute to
many
3 instead of 2.
examples of this.
And
Because I'm going to have to
okay,
take
now I have to
people
go
out.
retire now. I got to do it now. And
I'm
I
gonna have to
went
get
outside,
you
and after I got all the
some
tools and stuff, and then after that, Dad came out and he put a guy on hold, and he like told me what to do. And I got the thing, and after I pushed the car up, but I forgot to put the emergency brake on. Yeah, the jack. And I forgot to put the emergency brake on. And so the car.
Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about these. So we talked about the circular flow model. By the way, I said if you go to Google circular flow, you end up with literally millions of hits from different presentations online.
I had it already done it twice where I lifted it
all
up
kinds of examples of what the circular flow model looks like. And they all have sort of different configurations. But what I'm going to do is simply talk about the idea. I'm just going to sort of use my own configuration here. The households here. I'm going to put government in the middle, and I'll put business firms out here. Okay, so these two private sector actors here, government in the middle, and I put government in the middle for no particular reason other than the fact that it sort of fits there.
Put it down.
Yeah.
There we go.
Because ours didn't work.
Hey, Mason, I think you're the guy who's making a lot of noise here, dude. Please mute yourself.
Oh yeah, I was actually wondering.
I'm trying to actually remove him from the class here. Just there you go. Good job. Thank you. Okay, so everyone, please mute your mics when you come into class. It just makes things easier. Again, as I mentioned, I'll try to fix this issue of how to turn the projector off, leave the camera on. This setup is a little bit new to me here. I was working over the summer and in the spring semester. I actually had all my classes were this kind of setup in the spring semester, and it was a different technology, so different building altogether. So we'll figure that out. Hopefully this is not too distracting, but in the circular flow model, we've got households, government firms. So we've got all three actor groups here. So what we're looking to do here is to describe the interactions between, describe the interactions among these actors, okay? So what are these interactions and what can we talk about? Well, so in the most basic discussion we could say is that business firms do what? They provide goods to households, right? So goods flow in this particular direction here. That is, all of us as households buy goods. And who do we buy goods from? Well, we can buy from other individuals, but typically we buy them from business firms. We don't typically go buy food from other people. By the way, if we do, or if we buy a service or a good from another person, then that person is effectively acting as a business firm. And I think that's an important thing for us to be aware of, is that sometimes the role of actors change, that as a household can become a business firm if it acts as a business firm. So if, for instance, you decide to build your own house, which people do, right? Or build their own car, which people do, then that effectively makes you, if you're wanting to sell it, right? You're acting as your own contractor, you want it, and even if you don't sell it, you're cutting out the firm and doing it yourself. And a lot of people don't do that. Most people don't have the skills to do that. It's not very efficient from a production standpoint, often from a cost standpoint, particularly if you factor in time. So I think that's an important thing to consider, is the fact that the role of business firms providing goods to households is really a hallmark of the Industrial Revolution, which, by the way, we're going to talk a bit about when we get into after, say, next week, and we start talking about economic history, which is really a sort of a centerpiece of this course, is to talk about how we got where we are from, a very primitive type of economic relationship, mostly agrarian and whatnot, to an industrial economy, which is arguably the most radical thing to happen to human beings from an economic standpoint ever, industrialization, which is only about 200 years old over a span of a very, very long time period of humanity. And so this idea of business firms providing goods is very important. Also within this flow, what do households do in terms of their exchange? They provide labor to business firms. This is also a hallmark of industrialization, people leaving home to go work, providing labor to business firms. And obviously households do provide labor to government as well. And I don't want to exclude that, but it's not really the main focus of what we're trying to get to here, but we will work with this. And by the way, this circular flow model is a sort of an expandable sort of model. When we talk about a model, let's step back a little bit and talk about what is a model. It's a representation, it's an illustration, it's a simulation of reality. It's also a sort of a blueprint, right? So think about like a blueprint for a house. Let's say you're going to buy a house and you look at a builder's specifications, you have a blueprint there, you see, 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, and you see where the living room is located and whatnot, but you don't have a lot of detail. There's not every single details there. You don't see light switches and carpeting and doorknobs. It's not really necessary for you to get the idea of what the overall dimensions are. And so here, we don't need to get the overall dimensions of what precise kinds of labor. We just know that households leave work and go, or leave home to go provide labor to firms. And what is very interesting is what's happening, and has happened with the pandemic, where a lot of people are working at home. This is a gigantic economic story from the standpoint of labor. And that is the idea of a lot of people began working at home out of necessity during the pandemic, and then found that they enjoyed it. Obviously, it's nice to not have to, if you have a job where you had to get dressed and maybe wear a suit, nice shoes and whatnot, maybe you don't have to do that now. You can do your work just as efficiently. And what's more importantly, I think, is the fact that a lot of employers found out that people are just as productive at home as they were when they came to the office. And we've seen this again and again. I know that a lot of us in our faculty here have been doing online classes for a very long time. And so we've had to set up home offices and arrangements, but it seems to work for us. And I know I was just talking to my wife's cousin the other night, and she works at one of the big insurance companies, and she decided that she wanted to work at home, and she does all the work there, has a home office set up and does everything that she does, and it's, it never leaves the house. And I said, well, isn't it like a conflict? Because, aren't you tempted to sort of break away from your desk and go take clothes from the washer and put them in the dryer and all that, and run to the post office and whatever? And she said, yeah, I do that, but I also know I've got to get this amount done. So this idea of leaving home and going to business firms is maybe a little bit more fluid than what we thought before. But the big issue, though, is the fact that households are providing the labor to someone else, who is in turn providing goods to them. Well, there's a missing piece here, obviously, okay? And that is the money flow, which goes in the opposite direction. That business firms aren't a charitable operation, they're for profit. And so for profit means that they have to be paid for their efforts, obviously. And so spending goes in the other direction to compensate for the value of those goods. And by the way, pretty much everywhere, economics and finance and accounting we say that the value of something, whatever that something is what someone is willing to pay for it. What someone's willing to pay for it. And maybe that's not a perfect measure, but what is the value of a loaf of bread? Well, it's the, maybe if you don't like the price of a loaf of bread that you see at Albertsons, then I suppose you got the freedom not to buy it. And if in fact everyone else stays away from that price of that loaf of bread, then perhaps Albertsons lowers the price, and so that becomes the new value of that good. We see this happening all the time. We're seeing prices fluctuate, that is, values fluctuate in housing right now. The housing market's taken a big hit because of higher interest rates. The government is trying to slow this economy down because we've got inflation sort of running out of control. So as a result of that, it makes it more expensive to borrow money to buy a home. And the real estate market is all about financing. And so right now we're seeing home prices fall pretty dramatically. And not in every market, not every place in the country, but we're still in the early stages. For those of you who follow interest rates, maybe work in banking or have some kind of connection to real estate, really rates haven't moved up all that much. We're only back to where we were in 2019 in terms of the rates that the government itself manages. The long-term mortgage rate itself has reacted a little bit more to that because the government has said that they're going to keep raising rates. But my point is, though, the value of anything is the value of what somebody's willing to pay for it and what someone's willing to accept for it. So from the standpoint of what's the value of the goods is what someone's willing to pay for it. Obviously, people don't go to work for free. As a result, there've got to be wages coming the other direction, and wages obviously are paid in terms of dollars. And so you've got a wage flow in that direction. And so what is the value of your labor? It's the value of what someone's willing to pay you for it. Now, if you don't like the wage that you're making, you think, you know what, I'm not being paid enough. I think the value of my labor is much more significant than what my employer thinks it is, then you are free to do what exactly? You are free to go get another job. What with your feet? And I know that a lot of times you might read in economics textbooks or see places where economists will talk about workers demanding higher wages, or even on the news, because we've been certainly seeing that a lot with discussions about wage inflation as part of this whole inflationary picture, that workers are in fact demanding higher wages. Well, how are they doing that? Are they walking in saying, you know, pounding on the desk of their boss and saying, hey, we need a higher wage? Not really. They do it because they leave and go elsewhere, and employers get the message, hey, I'm losing people, I need to raise wages. And so the message gets heard oftentimes loud and clear, and we're seeing that. Or if they're not getting enough applicants for their particular occupation, they get the message they need to raise the wage as well. Okay, so that's how workers demand higher wages, and right now we're seeing wages go up, and it's really part of this whole inflationary picture. One thing I'll say about it is the fact that I know that there are economists in the past, and maybe even some, and probably more likely in politics, who argue that higher wages cause inflation. In fact, I think it's just the opposite. Higher wages are a response to inflation, that really the inflation began in the market for goods and services, and wages have sort of gone up as a result of that. It's not the fact that workers have forced wages up or prices up. It's the fact that prices have forced wages up. Okay. All right. So questions about the circular flow model. There are lots of areas that we can build on. What I do want to do is this, though. I've got, these are different colors, and hopefully these come through okay on your, in your Zoom screen. But when we talk about the green and the red are there for a purpose, and I wanted to talk about what these are. These red flows here are what we call the physical flow. The physical flow. And that is, and by the way, and I'll say right at the outset, that term is probably already a little bit outdated, right? Because at one time, I think most goods were physical goods. And I'm going to talk about the difference between these physical goods and non-physical goods here in just a second. But most goods were physical in nature, and you can look at, you can touch, and you can on a truck and drop it on your foot and all that. But today, a lot of goods are not necessarily that. So, and then labor used to be mostly physical in nature. Today, not so much. The term is really a little bit outdated. A term that I know sort of got rejuvenated in the financial crisis was something called the quote unquote real economy. And that was particularly to be used to distinguish it from the financial economy, which we'll talk about here in just a second. The quote unquote real economy. And that is the economy which we all live in, where we buy goods and we earn wages, or we buy goods, we buy labor. And as a result of that, it's the so-called real economy, which was distinct from this green flow, which we're simply going to call the financial flow. And the financial flow is a little bit more nebulous, frankly, where we simply call it the money economy. The quote unquote money, and I put these in quotes because they're not, so much the official terms as they are sort of just a way of viewing them. The money economy is a little bit different, obviously, than the real economy, in the sense that even though the prices of goods are denominated in dollars, which are paid for both in terms of spending on goods and spending on wages, they're paid in dollars. It's a little bit more nebulous. In fact, a lot of times people don't want to reveal what their wages are to other people. And a lot of times the prices of goods, firms are a little bit reluctant to talk about the price. You're going to buy a new car and they don't want to really talk about price very much. They want to sort of get you in a room and get you comfortable and get you settled in and get you investing time before they start talking about price. So the financial flow is a little bit more nebulous. It's not really talked about, where people, your next door neighbor buys a fancy car, but may not want to tell you what he paid for the car. So we're a little bit funny that way, in the sense that we want everybody to know that we are employed as some fancy occupation, but really don't want to describe what our wages are. And so, in fact, that's one of the rudest questions you can ask somebody is how much do you make per year, right? And so people don't really want to do that. It's more undercovered. So that's what's difficult about this is the fact that one is very overt, labor and goods, and the other is not quite so much. But these are the two flows. And the real economy, the term real economy, I should point out, was sort of a reaction to the fact that the last financial crisis, which was 2008, 2009, where we had lots of trouble in real estate lending and banks were failing and whatnot. And this whole money part of the economy was sort of teetering on the edge. So people would say, well, what's going on in the real economy? And then everyone would say, well, the real economy is doing okay. We're still going to work. We're still buying goods. We can't help it that the money economy is messed up. And in fact, from an economic policy standpoint, when an economy has gotten off the rails, it's very often not the fact that people aren't going to work and the firms aren't producing goods. It's there's something going wrong in the financial system. There's some sort of disconnect going on there. And that's a lot of what economic policy is intended to do, is to try to correct those imbalances, and I think that economists have put themselves pretty well in this area, because what could have been easily a depression turned into a recession that we recovered from relatively quickly. And the same goes with the very, very, very short recession that we had with the COVID pandemic. That recession, which is defined as a downturn in the economy, only lasted about 2 months. I think it was February, March of 2020, and then the economy began to grow again once the government injected stimulus into the economy. And a lot of us have heard the term stimulus again and again and again in the last few years, and it's because of the fact that it's been an economic response to a real problem in the economy. It has been, and I think it's been relatively successful at dealing with what the issues were. Okay, so that's the circular flow model, and as I said before, there's this is a model that can be expanded and contracted. We're going to sort of build on this a little bit as we go throughout the rest of the semester. We're particularly going to talk about imports and exports, and that is the entire value of international trade, etc. So we're going to get into that a bit and talk a bit about what's going on there. We may talk a bit about banking, where banking fits in. I don't know so much that we're going to have that much time to do it, but we'll try to get there. Okay. All right. So questions for me about anything on the circular flow model. I'm going to sort of bring this back here because I do want to talk about one more thing before we are done, and that is, and by the way, this doesn't look exactly like what you see in the textbook, but as I said at the outset, that there are all kinds of different examples of circular flow models you'll see out there running around the world. And so, but as long as they have the same sorts of relationships, I think that's really what we're talking about. So what I'm going to talk about now is this idea of goods and services. Okay, so I talked a bit about this idea of this red arrow here. And what that red arrow was about, and it was the idea of going from firms to households. Well, what about goods? And what can we say about goods, particularly versus services? And I'm going to give you a bit of a contradiction here a little bit. And I turned the lights down a little bit. Hopefully that's a little bit easier for you to see. I didn't turn them off all the way, but hopefully that's a little bit easier to see on your screens there. So what about goods and services? We've heard this term before, and they kind of go together, kind of like shoes and socks and cereal and milk and whatnot, but they're different. And we're going to say that goods are distinct from services in the sense that goods have a physical substance. That is, you can pick them up and move them, put them on a pallet, put them on a truck, move them, shoplift them, burn them up in a fire. In other words, they could be inventory. That is, they could be accounted for and counted and whatnot. And so they're easy to be stored. And there tends to be a lag time between the production of goods and the consumption of goods. And this is, if you look on week 2's syllabus, we'll see that this week is about production and consumption. That's really what we're talking about here. The production of goods, the consumption of goods. And we're going to build on this. I don't think we're going to have time to get into the production possibilities model today. There may be some questions on the quiz about that, but hopefully you'll have the opportunity to read that in the book. It's not particularly onerous, I don't think, but nonetheless, we'll probably not get there today. I do want to talk a bit, though, about this difference. These are physical goods. It tends to be the case that washing machines produced maybe in March of one year, and somebody ends up buying it in September, and so there's a lag time. In the meantime, it becomes inventory. It sits around. But there's a difference between that and services. And services whatsoever. Whatever physical substance to the good itself is, I would say, mostly incidental. If you go to an attorney to get a will drawn up, you pay an attorney $1,000 or whatever, you walk out with pieces of paper. You didn't pay $1,000 for pieces of paper, you paid $1,000 for the service that the attorney was providing. So whatever physical substance is mostly irrelevant, and it's meaningless. Just same with, say, a medical procedure and whatnot. There's oftentimes no evidence that you've purchased a good, but in fact you have, right? So there's little or no physical substance. Whatever physical substance there is mostly incidental. It can't easily be inventory. That is, it's not really possible to put on the shelf these goods. Lawyers don't produce wills and put them on the shelf waiting for you to show up to buy them, do they? That really wouldn't make a lot of sense. And so as a result, there's nothing like, or an accountant doesn't prepare your tax returns before you show up. They're not waiting for you to buy those tax returns, just any old tax returns, right? They're going to produce them for you. So they're not really easily inventory. And I say easily, why don't I say can't be inventory? Well, there are some areas like research and whatnot where research is done and sort of metaphorically put on the shelf and at some point pulled back out. That's a small portion of services, but for the most part, not easily inventory. They tend to be produced and consumed at more or less the same time. Yes, there's a lag time. You drop your tax returns information off to the accountant on a Monday, and he says, pick them up on Saturday. And so yes, I guess there's a bit of a lag time, but not very much. And in fact, in some services, you've got to be there, right? You can't get your tooth pulled and say, go ahead and get started on that, and I'll pick up that on Thursday. It doesn't really work. You have to be present at the same time that it's done. Same with getting a haircut or medical procedures. They tend to be at the very same time, which is why they're not necessarily inventoriable in nature. So there is a difference between goods and services in that regard, in the sense physical and one not so much. Okay. And the final thing I'll talk about is types of goods. So types of goods, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but these are what we call dichotomous pairs. That is, these goods are opposite one another. A good that is a substitute is also not a complement. A good that's a normal good is also not an inferior good. And what are these? So goods that are substitutes are those goods which can be relatively easily swapped out for another in a purchase decision. And the list of substitutes is long for a lot of goods, right? So if in fact the price of sugar is rising, then people might choose to consume what? Well, a sugar alternative, like a sweetener, like Sweet Low, or Equal, or Splenda, or something like that, right? So it's oftentimes price is the determining characteristic as to what good gets purchased. So if the price of beef is rising, people buy less beef and buy more chicken or something, right? As a result, as a substitute. However, goods that are complements are those goods whose demand, whose purchase coincides or goes along with another good, either because it makes sense or because they're integral to the good itself. And there are some goods that just simply go together. They're not required. You don't have to go and buy both of them together, but you're going to. So if you're going to buy hot dogs, you're probably going to buy hot dog buns. Now, are you going to buy hot dog buns without hot dogs? I mean, you can, nobody's going to stop you. But does it make a lot of sense to do that? And does anybody really do that? And the answer is probably not, right? So hot dogs and hot dog buns go together. And a lot of goods go together. That shampoo and conditioner go together, right? Milk and cereal go together. Peanut butter and jelly go together. Salt and pepper. The list of goods that are purchased in tandem with one another go along, are all everywhere throughout the economy. And finally, the last one I want to talk about is normal goods and inferior goods. Normal goods are those goods which the demand goes up and down with income. They are all luxury goods for normal goods because we know that people demand less luxury goods when incomes are falling and more when incomes are rising. But it's not just, they're called normal because they react the way you would expect them to react with changes in income. They go up. On the other hand, what's more interesting are inferior goods where the demand goes inversely to income. So if incomes are falling, people demand these goods more because they're less expensive. And so rather than going to the movies, if we're in a bad economic time, people will do things like maybe tune in maybe to Netflix rather than going out to the movies. Or rather than going to a nice restaurant, maybe somebody does fast food or something different. Those are inferior. Well, these are dichotomous, that is, they're opposite one another. Okay, so my time is up. I've got about 30 seconds left. Are there questions for me about anything we talked about today? It's a good time. You can't unmute yourself. Put something in the chat box. I try to pay attention to that the best I can. Again, the geography of the room is a little bit challenging there. I will try to work on this issue of the projector. I'll try to work more on the projector throughout the class as opposed to on the whiteboard. It will make it easier. Plus, these are also replicated as slides in your Brightspace page. And I'm sure one of the much smarter people technically than me in our distance learning department can figure out the issue with PowerPoints. So we'll get that addressed fairly quickly. The only thing we didn't really cover was the production possibilities model. Go ahead and read that in the text, see what you think about that. And there might be a question or two on the quiz. I don't recall exactly, but we will pick that up next time. And so everybody have a great rest of your week, and I will see you on Wednesday. Okay? Bye-bye.